Hello, Wanderers. Welcome back to the Lore of the Rings podcast. I'm here with Jason Densil, who is a fantasy author and expert on all things Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. We'll dig into that just a little bit more a little later on. But welcome, Jason. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Aaron. I'm really glad to be here.
So, why don't you take a minute or two and tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what you have to offer for a Lord of the Rings podcast?
Yeah, I'm sure that right now people are scratching their heads and wondering, Wheel of Time. Wait a minute, I thought I was listening to a Lord of the Rings podcast. And I think there's a little bit of a interesting overlap, and there's some fun things there. So yeah, I've been a fan of the Lord of the Rings, both the books and the movies, for a long time. I was in college 20 years ago when I read the books for the first time, the Lord of the Rings for the first time, The Hobbit. And then that was around the time that the movies were in production. And I got out of college right around the time that they premiered. And about that same time, in addition to being a big Lord of the Rings fan, I was reading the Wheel of Time series, which is another popular epic fantasy series. That is, I'll say, descended from Lord of the Rings, if you will, by the late Robert Jordan. And at the time, this was 1998, 25 years ago. And I was in college learning to make websites. At the time, there were seven Wheel of Time books out, and the eighth one was about to be published. And I was rereading the series, and I was away at school, and I didn't have anyone to talk to about it. And so I made a website, somehow cobbled together some forums, and the website, dragonmount.com, took off right away. And so 25 years later, it remains to this day one of the big premier fan communities surrounding that series. Robert Jordan died in 2007, and he left the series incomplete. And then another author who has since gone on to become immensely popular, Brandon Sanderson, came in and finished that book series. And so over the years, I had the opportunity to get to know Robert Jordan. I've had a chance to become friends with Brandon and with other people involved in the series. At one point, I was briefly a consultant for a movie adaptation of the series, and I've just been in the mix for 25 years with all things Wheel of Time. And so it's been a real joy recently in that I picked up a copy of the Lord of the Rings, and I read it with my teenage son. And it had been the first time in all those years that I had gone back and read the books. Of course, I've seen the movie a million times, and I enjoyed the Rings of Power TV show. But it was fun to sit down and read the books again with my son. And after that, after we finished it, I wanted to explore the wider world, which was right around the time the show was coming out. And that's how I found your show.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great intro. And for our listeners who may not be familiar with Wheel of Time, that is there how many books total is there? There's like 12 books.
There's more than that. There,
Oh boy.
there's yeah, there's 14 main sequence novels telling one continuous story. What's crazy is that only spans like 3 years total, 3 or 4 years total, I think,
Oh wow.
across all 14 books. Featuring all the same characters, more or less,
Hmm.
a growing cast as the book goes on. The books go on.
I read one Wheel of Time book back in the day and decided that was enough for me. So I'm impressed that you've read all of the main story and more and not only once but multiple times. So that's no small feat. So congratulations to you on that.
By and large, these are two franchises, two legendariums
Hmm.
that span that have a lot of similarities. Robert Jordan, without a doubt, was immensely influenced by Tolkien. I remember listening on to another one of your episodes with when you had another guest, and you were talking about how Tolkien is like Mount Fuji. So that George R. R. Martin
Hmm.
was quoted as saying it's always in the background of every other fantasy
Hmm.
story. It looms large, and it's true. Robert Jordan and authors like David Eddings and Terry Brooks,
Hmm.
all are like the generation that came after Tolkien. And after the Silmarillion was published, there was a big hunger for more fantasy literature. And
Hmm.
when lots of authors came to the table, and some with great success and some others with lesser success tried to emulate what J.R. Tolkien had done. But in my view, and the view of a lot of people, it really wasn't until Robert Jordan showed up in the early 90s, really, with the publication of the first book in 1990, that he really evolved that story. And I think the addition that Robert Jordan brought to it, that was, if you imagine like in taking the Lord of the Rings and the wider legendarium, and then apply a heavy dose of King Arthur, apply a heavy dose of the story of a Messiah into it, and the pros and cons of something like that. And that starts, and also a heavy dose of having women in the story. And that felt like an evolution of the conversation. If fantasy literature is an ongoing conversation, Robert Jordan was, I think, the next big step in that. And that continues on today. I mentioned Brandon Sanderson, who of course is doing, his own amazing stuff that's probably maybe a lot of your viewers have listened to. There's so many other fantasy writers that are continuing that tradition as well.
You've published a handful of fantasy books as well, and you're starting to enter into that conversation. So how has sort of Tolkien's writing, how has his work influenced you as you've stepped into that role of continuing the conversation as a fantasy author?
Well, he certainly looms large. And again, so I've written 3 books, a complete trilogy, the Mystic Trilogy, that's available through Tor Books. Those books were written before I reread Tolkien. So it's hard for me to pinpoint a direct influence, but of course that looms large. It's a fantasy world, and there's magic, and there's all the staples, wizards. I've got wizard towers, I've got magical mystical mountains, and I've got all sorts of strange creatures, and all these things that Tolkien brought forth from our collective myths and legends and tried to intentionally create into a documented fictional story. And that's what we're all doing now. I largely think in terms of influence, the influences on me, when I look at character, maybe not the specifics of the character, but trying to understand, why in the Lord of the Rings, what makes Samwise so special? Like, why do you just love that guy to death? And what is it about Merry and Pippin that are so compelling? When Pippin knocks over, the skeleton into the well, and Gandalf's full of a took, and it's like, that's such a great moment, such an iconic moment. And so I think a lot about, like, how do I capture an idea like that? Not straight up copying the ideas or the beat or the moment, but I try to think, these are the characters that are so special. When I'm writing, I want to craft people that you care about, and that we can relate to.
We're not done yet. If you like this episode, please leave a review and share with your friends. And remember to subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be right back.
Do you ever find yourself thinking about who would win in a fight between Goku and Superman? Hi, I'm James Gavsey, and on the Who Would Win show, me and my co-host Ray ignore anything important happening in the outside world and debate fictional battles between characters from comics, movies, and video games.
We got a new show every week, and almost always am I the winner.
Yeah, not true, Ray.
In the past, we've discussed such matches as Captain America versus Darth Vader, Solid Snake versus the Iron Giant, classic matchups like RoboCop versus Terminator, and even the Muppets versus Sesame Street.
That one was crazy. So if you're a fan of geek culture and love a spirited debate, check out the Who Would Win show wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out at whowouldwinshow.com.
Now, you mentioned the Silmarillion just a minute ago, and I think you are reading it for the first time. Where are you in the Silmarillion? What do you think? Is it what you expected? Are you surprised at all? Tell us about the Silmarillion.
I have been absolutely blown away by this book. I thought it was, I had heard, of course, that it was a dense read. I went into it expecting almost not an encyclopedia per se, but I expected it to be really, really dry. And I was amazed at how compelling the narrative is, even if it isn't a beat by beat, line by line,
Mm,
traditional story. But
mhm.
I'm hooked on this right now. And just last night, I'm in the midst of the Baron and Luthien story. I'm
Oh, yes.
right in the midst of that. Now, I've been listening to your podcast, and I know how this story ends. I know the gist of it. I had kind of known the gist of it beforehand, so it wasn't. I usually am very spoiler adverse, but in this case, I didn't mind having the spoilers and having your podcast to kind of explain it, because I didn't get all the details, but I knew enough of what was coming that when I was reading it, it helped me have this frame of reference. One of the big things that I have loved about this story, and I know it's the heart of the story, and before this, I was more or less just a very passionate fan of the movies who had read the books years ago. So I felt like I knew,
Right.
the Lord of the Rings a lot. I certainly did. I
Mhm.
certainly knew the movies very well, but a lot of the deeper lore eluded me, or I only kind of knew, bits and pieces of it. And one of the mysteries that I always kind of wondered about is like, what exactly is up with, why are the elves leaving Middle Earth in the movies?
Mm.
Why is it sad that they are leaving? Why are they fading? Why is it the age of man now? I didn't understand that until I started reading this book. It has been amazing to me, this underlying theme of the idea that the elves are immortal and the men are, well, some of them are jealous of that. And that,
Mhm.
and that it all comes back to that one group was given this immortality and another was not. And there's pros and cons to each one.
Yep.
And
Mhm.
that is kind of one of the driving, that's certainly probably the driving conflict of the second age. And you
Mhm.
see it
Yep.
emerging here in the first age. And so that whole story coming forth has been so exciting to me. I love the story of Fëanor and crafting the Silmarils and the doom of Mandos and all these things that are surrounding it. That's been something that has just been amazing. I think here I am, in my 40s, and crafting my own books now, and doing this, and I am getting a master class in world building
Yep.
from Tolkien. I'm very grateful that I'm experiencing it now. I've been the school of Jordan for so many years, and
Mhm.
learning immense amounts from that and from other authors, of course. But for whatever reason, I was able to save Tolkien's deep dive and seeing how he crafted these books. That's been amazing. One other thing too is that in as I'm reading the the story of Beren and Luthien, I also have the book Beren and Luthien that was published
Mm.
on its
Yeah.
own.
Mhm.
And I've been reading them in parallel because the book, for your listeners who may not be familiar, in addition to the story that's in, the Silmarillion, they also, there's lots of versions of
Yes.
Beren
Different
and
drafts.
Luthien.
Mhm.
Yeah, he different drafts. He Tolkien wrote this, as you've talked about in your show. The first inklings we have of this story, he wrote when he was in his 20s in World War One, and then of
Mhm.
course it evolved over the years. And so a lot of those drafts are available, and they were collected together in different forms in a book called Beren and Luthien that was published in the 2017 or something like that.
Right.
And so I've been reading them together, and it's really interesting. This, like, in one version, the early versions, Beren was an elf, and in the
Mhm.
official canon version, he's a man. And it's
Yep.
interesting to see like how that story evolved. And as a
Yeah.
writer myself, I have found that interesting, and also it's a little bit of a relief because I'm like, okay, well, I'm not the only person, the only other author who changes his mind midway
Oh,
through and has to go back and change things.
yeah. Tolkien was notorious for that. I mean, he held such a high standard for himself, right? That he would write these drafts, and then he'd go back through and rewrite and rethink and rewrite and rethink. And I don't know if you've come across this book right here. It's called the Nature of Middle Earth. But this was published just about last year, and it's got even more drafts to it. And one of the things as that I take away when I read Nature of Middle Earth is just how painstakingly precise Tolkien wanted to be about things. Like he would draw, here's how the sun goes over the land, and here's how the moon goes over the land. And does that fit? Does that actually make scientific sense within my world? Like he was so precise about those things. And so he would go back to his drafts and just nitpick himself. He was so just precision on that. So yeah, as a fantasy author, he definitely went through those drafts for sure. And I don't know if you've gotten to the part in that Baron and Luthien story. It's been a while since I actually read the book, but there's one version where when they come to Morgoth, they have to like go through like these cats or something. There's like these queen of cats. I can't remember exactly, but
Yeah, I
yeah.
haven't gotten there yet, but
Okay.
I read about it in the introduction to the Baron and Luthien book. Christopher Tolkien mentions that there's like a queen of cats, and I was like, "What?"
Yes.
And so I Googled it, and
Yes.
I was like, "Huh, that is the weirdest thing." So,
Well, there's
um,
this really offhand reference that Aragorn makes at some point in the books, and I can't remember where it is, but he makes some reference to like, we'll run away like Queen Baruthiel's cats or something like that. And there's
oh,
like
really?
that's it. That's like the only
That's it.
reference. But then you go to one of those drafts of Baron and Luthien, and it's like, oh, that's maybe what he was thinking about. But who knows, right? It was a draft, so who knows?
But yeah, that care and detail and that meticulousness is, yeah, is readily apparent, and it is amazing. And span over the course of 50 years, and I have a all new respect for Christopher Tolkien, who
Yes.
would talk about in some of these, in his forewords and other things, how like he started doing this after his father died, which I guess I didn't realize. I always thought that he
Mm-hmm.
collaborated with his father beforehand, but no, he began it after the fact. There were notes from everywhere. There he would
Mm-hmm.
have
Yep.
drafts written on paper and then erased and then written on top of the same paper
Yep.
and then maybe on someone's test grade,
Yep.
some assignment from another box in another room found another year later.
Some
It had
Oxford
some of
class
those,
schedule or something.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, who knows?
But the story that goes that he wrote The Hobbit, he was doing exam papers, he was grading exams, and a student had left a page empty in the exam book. And so he turns the page and just writes, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit.
Yeah,
Boom. Out
I've
of
always
nowhere,
loved that.
right?
Another thing I found interesting is that it seemed like Tolkien, in certainly in his I'll say in his youth, his 20s, his 30s, his 40s, or whatever, he had all these ideas for different book projects, and like that he wanted to write I learned recently that he wanted to write a novel about this the lost city of Atlantis,
Mhm.
and that he actually it had a title, and he began writing it, and that was where the idea of Numenor came
Mhm.
from. And then when he couldn't make it work by itself, he just kind of lumped it in to
Yeah.
his already expanding world of the Baron and Luthien world, which had become the Morgoth world, which had become and slowly everything kind of came together in that way. And I think the Hobbits that you mentioned were also intended to do that. Like he started off writing the Hobbit, he wasn't necessarily thinking. I mean, I get the impression that when the story of the Hobbit wasn't necessarily going to be something that was lumped into the Middle Earth saga that he was
Mhm.
creating.
Mhm.
It was hobbits aren't even mentioned or a part of his first age and second age stories. They just kind of show up, and he made it work after. I think he talks about that in uh, the prologue to the Lord of the Rings. I think he talks about
Yeah.
just
Mhm.
sticking them together,
Yep. Making it work
which is
together.
brilliant, which is great. You get these great ideas sometime and they independently arise, you make them work. And that's something else that I can relate to is, I've got one idea over here and one idea over here, and they just kind of stew in the background. And suddenly it dawns on me like, hey, this would be great if I were to put it into my current project. I kind of steal for myself. And in his case, it seems like everything that he worked on, eventually he got to gel together mostly harmoniously.
Yeah, it's interesting to think like all of these things sort of came to him in bits and pieces, and then he would kind of realize, oh, I can connect these together, and he'd kind of go back and do some revisions. If you look at the lens of it all is one great whole, I mean,
Mhm.
it's amazing to me how much of it makes sense, even though it didn't all come out, A
Yes.
to Z from the beginning to the end. It didn't all come out in chronological order, but Yeah.
I wonder how much of that, kind of thinking a lot, and maybe this is answered. I'm sure that there are experts who, other people that you can perhaps have on your show, and in addition to yourself. But I wonder how much of that is due to Christopher Tolkien being able to kind of smooth out those edges for us.
Right.
To for instance, Christopher has talked about, and you have talked about in your show, about how Galadriel is the character that doesn't quite have the most cohesive story start to finish. There's a bunch, there's discrepancies throughout the different versions of Galadriel out there. And I found that really interesting. When I heard that, I heard it first on your podcast. I heard about that. I thought, that's really cool, because she's such an important character, certainly in the new TV show and everything. And so I was curious, like, what is her story? So I did a deep dive down in with Galadriel, and for a couple days to kind of get to understand what was going on. And it's true. It seems like that she was a character that he made up on the spot, and then later he had all these ideas, and these ideas evolved, and she went from being generic elven sorceress to being this really complex character who had a role in so much, and ends up being the chief across 3 ages, the ultimate nemesis of Sauron, which is a really big character arc.
We're not done yet. If you like this episode, please leave a review and share with your friends. And remember to subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be right back. Let's see. We've mentioned Rings of Power. We've danced around that a little bit, the Amazon TV show. I want to go there, but before we do, you are a Wheel of Time expert. You're a Robert Jordan expert. And Amazon also did an adaptation for Wheel of Time. Now, I watched that series. I'm not necessarily a Wheel of Time expert, but I watched that sort of with an apprehensive view, you might say. I wanted to know, how is Amazon going to approach this huge body of fantasy work? How are they going to approach that in terms of adaptation, in terms of accuracy to the author's themes and vision and works? I couldn't tell whether or not it was canon or not, right? I wasn't that expert, but give me your sort of assessment, like on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being Amazon nailed it 100%, and 1 being Amazon just trashed it. Where would you put the series of Wheel of Time as a whole?
That's a great question, because I think that first of all, I think both shows, both the Wheel of Time on Amazon and Rings of Power, they very much feel like sibling projects. They have a lot of the Wayne Yip was a director on both shows. They have a similar vibe in a way, that came out around the same time, and the same executives at the studio were overseeing them. So there was overlap there, right? For Wheel of Time, I usually, for the season 1, also, and very importantly, both of them were impacted by COVID in a big way. They were in the middle of filming their first seasons when the pandemic first hit, and that had a pretty big impact. I think it even had a bigger impact on Wheel of Time. They had filmed the first 6 out of 8 episodes of the Wheel of Time when the pandemic hit, and they had to shut things down for a long time. And when they came back, they were able to resume filming, but only with strict guidelines. Like, the actors weren't allowed to stand next to each other closer than 6 feet. And so if you watch those final 2 episodes of the Wheel of Time in season 1, the actors are not standing next to each other, or they're standing 6 feet apart. And, I think that had an impact on things. On your 1 to 10 scale for season 1, I've been telling people I put the show at about a 6, with the COVID impacting it. I give them a little bit of a pass. So I give them a +1, so 7 out of 10. And honestly, and that's about where I put Rings of Power as well. I think that Wheel of Time, the first season pretty closely follows the story of book 1. So book 1, season 1, with the notable exception that they did make some changes. And just like with Rings of Power, there was a contingent of people who were not pleased with that, and they were not pleased with the changes in Wheel of Time either. The Eye of the World, book one of the Wheel of Time. Tell me if you've heard this one before. It starts in a sleepy little village with 4 young people living in the village who have never been outside, been to the big city or anything like that. And suddenly there's a dark rider lurking around in town. And a magic user comes to town, and this magic user comes to town and says, we got to go. We got to run away from these dark riders.
Yep.
And along the way, they've got another warrior who is the lost king of a nation, and all this. So like Jordan intentionally, when he wrote this book in the late 80s, intentionally followed a familiar path to Tolkien. And he did this, come along, reader. This is familiar turf to you. Let's come along. And then at a certain point, and that certain point is book 2, which will be season 2, he says, just kidding. I got something else for you. And you veer off in a completely different way. And in my view, I've always said to people that book 1, The Eye of the World, is great. If you can get through it, it's great. But it doesn't become amazing until book 2 in The Great Hunt. And that's where the characters, and it gets even better. 3 and book 4, and book 4 and 5 are considered by most people to be, the pinnacle of the series in terms of like just the amazing writing and everything else. It really finds its stride there. But it's in that second book that the Wheel of Time really stands out and separates itself from the pack.
Shifting gears a little bit to Rings of Power, like you came at that from, I love the movies. I read the book several years ago. What was your experience with Rings of Power?
So I came into Rings of Power very, very excited for it. I couldn't bring myself to have a high bar. I set a lower bar for myself because I didn't want to be disappointed. And which is kind of, so I prepared to be disappointed so that I wouldn't be disappointed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, and so in that way, it exceeded my expectations, and so I had a positive way. And I know that's a lot of mental gymnastics for that, but ultimately, I knew it was going to be beautiful. It's tough because ultimately, they're writing stories that Tolkien didn't write. I know there's it's like the macro story is there, but the micro stories aren't necessarily there. And I think that will get better over time. I like how they bring clarity to what the function of the rings are, or at least, and maybe you can answer this, because I think what the show was trying to say was that the rings will in the show, I know this is not book lore, but I think the show was trying to say that that the rings, the 3 elven rings that they made it in the final episode, will hold back the decay of the elves. Is that the idea?
Yeah. The show kind of tried to set it up to be like elves are losing the light, and therefore of Valinor. Therefore, we need to somehow have that light. So let's create some odd origin story for Mithril that ties it back to the Silmarils, that ties it back to the 2 trees of Valinor.
Which actually, and I recognize that isn't book lore, and I do recognize that it's a little convoluted, but at the same time, it's not a bad idea. I mean, like there is something kind of neat about it, because even though, and there's more than that, but having, doing this Tolkien deep dive that I have for the last couple of months, and having everything fresh in my mind, I'm still not exactly sure what the other rings besides the one ring do. Like, I'm not exactly sure what the 3 rings and the 9 rings, like, I mean, I know that, but like, what did, like, when a dwarf lord put on one of the 7 rings, what exactly did that dwarf lord get? And what did the elves get? And I'm excited that they are going to explore that in the show. I hope that it just resonates, and the whole idea of keeping back the fading, or the fading of the light, it resonates at least thematically, because I do now, as we talked about earlier, I get now like why the elves are, they're yearning for Valinor, they're wanting to return to it and everything, and I get it, trees and all that, and so it's okay if in Middle Earth, if the light is fading, I can understand that. That's why they have to leave, and that also makes sense to me that once the time of the rings is over at the end of the movies, once the one ring is destroyed and the time of the rings is over, then it makes sense that the light is starting to fade and they all have to go back to Valinor. So that that works for me, and maybe that's the idea, and that's what they're following.
Yeah, there's some complications with that, and there's some canonical deviations
Sure.
that have been made, right? Because the elves started to make rings, and they did it under the influence of Sauron, who they did not know was Sauron at the time.
Mhm.
And so they made like the 9 rings that eventually were given to men. They made the 7 rings that were eventually given to dwarves. And I think in Sauron's mind at that time, he's thinking, I need a way to dominate the other races. I've tried through force of arms, and these elves and these men and these dwarfs, they're just too valiant. They're just too strong. I can't beat them through force of arms. I need a more devious, a more crafty way to dominate these races to my will. Right. And so he comes as Anatar, he poses in a fair form, but what he's able to play into, his door into the elves is Celebrimbor. And Celebrimbor has a little bit of pride within him. His grandfather was Feanor, who made the Silmarils, right? And Celebrimbor is just saying, I want to be great like Feanor. Plus, you combine that with the elves who are living in Middle Earth, not in Valinor. The elves are immortal creatures, as we've said, but they're living in Middle Earth, which is a mortal place, right? And so all around them through time, the slow decay of time, right? As Elrond says about Aragorn, everything is going to die. So the elves, they say, we want to preserve these beautiful lands. We want to make these lands as beautiful and as amazing as what they've got over there in Valinor. Even though we're far away from the Valar, we don't have the Maiar, we're a lot more disconnected from them. We want to make Middle Earth like Valinor. So there's a little bit of hubris there in general amongst the elves. You combine that with Celebrimbor, who says, I want to be awesome like Feanor. And then Anatar slash Sauron has a way in. So now he's like saying, now let me teach you the crafts of ring making and how you can put your power into these rings. So Sauron goes, he's there, he helps them make some rings, he leaves to go make his one ring. While he's gone, the elves perfect their art and craft and they create the 3 elven rings. And those 3 rings were really their main purpose or power was to, we are going to slow the decay of this mortal world. We are going to preserve these realms that we have within us. So their power was one of preservation. It was one of healing. It was one of light. When Sauron comes and he claims the 7 and the 9 rings, he hands those out to men and dwarves. And what the rings really do is they sort of activate whatever is that core nature of that race. So for men, they want power and they don't want to die, right? And so those rings sort of stretch out their lives until they become the ring wraiths, right? Neither living nor dead. But for dwarves are just super hardy. They're super resilient. But what's kind of the core of their race? They love gold. They're greedy little creatures. And so all the rings really do for the dwarves, they don't come under Sauron's domination, but they sort of kind of go like gold crazy, right? You see a couple of things, there's a couple of scenes in the Hobbit movie, right, where Thorin's kind of going gold crazy a little bit.
Yes.
Like that's sort of the influence of the 7 rings on the dwarves.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, I see it. I thank you for that explanation. That's great. I can see. I remember too that in the books, Gandalf said something about, and you alluded to it too, is that Gandalf says that that before the ring, before the 3 and the 7 and the 9 that we know, that the elves were making essays of the craft,
Right.
with air quotes, essays of the craft. I take it to mean that they made rings of lesser power.
Yes.
And, and I always kind of wondered like what happened to those and what do those rings do? And
yeah, it's not clear to me if those essays are referring to like the 7 and the 9 before they got to the 3, or if they were like even outside of those, a handful of the great rings. Like I it's not really clear in my mind. It's but Gandalf. There's many magic rings in this world, Frodo, right? So who knows?
Yep,
who
exactly. And to bring it back to the show, I was hoping as a casual fan that the first season would explore some of those essays, or that we would see more, that we would see the Anatar that we had seen. And now I do like that they, in spirit, they hid Sauron They hid him in a fair form. And they made him relevant to, as a writer, I see, they made it relevant to the plot. They stuck him right there under Galadriel's nose, your main character. And that that was all well done. I kind of wish we had gotten more than half an episode of him influencing the elves on how to do it, on how to make magic rings. But I am looking forward to kind of seeing. They really did a great job with showing the Isle of Numenor. Which after I watched the show, I picked up a copy of a new book that was out called The Fall of Numenor. It was published, edited by Brian Sibley. And that was a fantastic, as far as I can tell, it's kind of like the best compilation of everything we know from Tolkien in the Second Age, with a heavy, emphasis on Numenor, of course. And that's where I was learning things about, like, for instance, that, Numenor story was originally, Tolkien's, version of Atlantis, based on the fact that he, in real life, had a reoccurring dream of a tidal wave wiping him out or whatever. And that's why he was obsessed with Atlantis. And that's why, and I love that in the show, there are visions of a tidal wave coming. That's straight from Tolkien. That's kind of cool. I'm curious, bringing this back to the rings. So, spoiler warning for the show and for the story in general, I guess, if that matters to anyone out there. Sauron comes to Numenor as a prisoner, and eventually, he takes control of the island or whatever. But what's interesting to me is that the timeline is such that he has the one ring on him. Like he is physically incarnate. He has the one ring, and he goes to Numenor. And then Numenor is destroyed and his body is destroyed. And I don't know how the ring got from Numenor back to Middle Earth after that.
Yeah. He left it behind, actually.
Yeah. So how did it get back? If the island sinks, spoilers.
He had the Tower of Barad-dûr, right? He had that tower, and he comes with his army. His army sees the Numenorian army led by Ar-Pharazôn, and they're like, we're out of here. We're not fighting this war. So his servants sort of leave him. And so he's taken as prisoner, but actually before he had even marched out, he had left the one ring back at Barad-dûr. Why? I don't know. I don't know why.
so he
didn't have it on him. He did not have it on him when he went to Numenor.
I can see Christopher Tolkien retconning that.
Yeah. I don't know.
Maybe.
I don't know
That's
the details on that one. We'll have to look at that one a little bit more. But,
that's kind of gutsy to leave your prized possession behind while you're spending 1,000 years in Numenor, and who knows who was sniffing around, and he's lucky Saruman didn't find it or something.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess Saruman hadn't come at that point.
That's true. It was second. Well, Jason, let's wrap this up. This has been a really fun conversation. Thanks for exploring all things Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of back and forth we could go through there. If our listeners wanted to learn a little bit more about your work, where should they go?
Yeah, thanks very much for that. So I'm on all the social medias at Jason Denzel, last name Denzel. But probably the best place is just to go to my website, jasondenzel.com. And there you can learn about my books, the Mystic Trilogy, about some other projects that I've been working on, and you can get links to my social media. I've got a newsletter, and if you sign up for the newsletter, you can get some samples of my books and my writing and things like that. So thanks for checking me out, and thanks for having me on the show. I do a lot of Wheel of Time podcasts, and this has been a real treat for me to be able to do a Lord of the Rings podcast. And I've been a big fan of it, of your show, and I've been listening to it every morning when I take my dog for a walk, and and so it's nice to chat with you directly and talk about all this. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, and thanks for being a listener. My friends, if you enjoyed this episode, let me know by subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing with your friends. Follow me on Facebook or Instagram at Lore of the Rings Podcast. For feedback on the show, please email me using the link in the show notes. Until next Thursday, remember, not all those who wander are lost.